Hello, welcome to Redaction Report and Slava Ukraini. This is going to be a limited edition show on Redaction Report. We're going to be talking about Ukrainian history, but we're not just doing it as a podcast like that. We're also doing a fundraiser. We are raising funds for Save the Children. They're doing some fantastic work helping young people, helping young children who are having to flee Ukraine because of the war. We're going to put a link below in the description. Please, if you're feeling generous, donate what you can, drop us what you can, and see what you can put towards their amazing work to help the people of Ukraine. We're going to start today with a fairly broad look at Ukrainian history, take a look at what Ukraine is, what the Ukrainian state has been, and the history of the Ukrainian people. I'm joined by Declan Carey, our good friend who spent a lot of time in Ukraine himself. Declan, how are you doing?
Yeah, not bad, thanks, James. Yeah, how are you doing?
Not too bad at all. So Ukraine, it's existed as a nation state since the fall of the Soviet Union, but it goes back a lot further than that. Declan, could you give us a bit of background?
So as you mentioned, it's existed as an independent nation now for just over 30 years since the USSR collapsed. But yeah, the people who live in that area of what we know as Ukraine today have had a Ukrainian identity going back much further than that, hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's a part of the world it's been part of many countries and empires throughout time. It's been part of Poland and Lithuania, parts of Czechoslovakia back when it was a country, owned parts of Ukraine in the West. It's obviously been part of the Russian Empire and, of course, the Soviet Union too. And obviously in the Second World War, it was a battleground between the German forces and the Soviet forces. So it's had a chaotic history. There's a lot that's happened in the region, but there's always been that Ukrainian identity, and that's a really important part of this conflict today too, because the Ukrainian people really cherish that. And of course, it's one of the claims that Russia said, trying to delegitimize that identity unsuccessfully, but it's one of the ways they're trying to fight this conflict. And it's going to be a huge talking point that we need to focus on, I think, in this series and further on, really.
Yes, because of course the history of Ukraine and the history of Russia have been intertwined for hundreds and hundreds of years. When we look at the history of Russia itself, what we're looking often back at, the origin point is the Kievan Rus. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? What's the history of Kiev itself, the capital city of Ukraine, and how did that tie in with Russia?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the Kiev Rus country was a state, obviously long before how we know Ukraine and Russia is today, long before the Soviet Union. It was a time when Kiev was a huge trading and cultural capital. That part of the world in the steppes, it's lots of goods passed through there, and Kiev was the place where everything was there. So it's one of the ways that ties Russia and Ukraine culturally, linguistically as well. They were always connected through that. There's been a bit of dispute about that too, about Russia and Ukraine both sort of claiming the origins of that kingdom. In truth, it's probably a bit of both. So it's definitely also something that's part of this conflict. And lots of Ukrainians are pointing out now that actually Kiev as a city was a big, powerful city when Moscow was, even partly just a village. So it's something worth remembering that Kiev is a really sort of important and powerful city. It always has been in the area, and it's something which many Russians consider to be Russian territory, which is what part of this conflict is about too. And of course, one of the big talking points I think we need to touch on too is during the Soviet times, when Ukraine was part of the USSR, not always willingly. Do you want to talk a bit about that, perhaps about the Holodomor?
So yes, there's a big historical discourse around Stalin's Great Famine in the Ukraine. There's a lot of discussion as to whether it should be considered a genocide, even. Millions of Ukrainians died in a completely man-made and preventable famine under Stalin, under the Soviet Union, which of course has scarred the nation. It's something well remembered in Ukraine to this day. Declan, you spent a lot of time in Ukraine, of course. What's the legacy of the Holodomor look like there?
Oh, it's huge. It's something you speak to anyone in there and they'll tell you about it. They'll be able to tell you, a story from a grandparent or great grandparent. It really affected everyone. And in Kiev and other cities, there are still memorials to it to remember the people who sadly lost their lives. As you mentioned, it was something that was avoidable. It was partly due to the agricultural policies of the USSR, of Stalin at the time. Turned out to be disastrous. It's something which many Ukrainians hold against Russia because it's almost indicative of the way that perhaps Russia has treated Ukraine over the years, almost as a country which they can exploit, they can dominate, they can use its resources without really having any sort of repercussions or consequences for that. So yeah, it's definitely an important thing. It's something that's on Ukrainians' mind. And if maybe Ukrainians are thinking, well, what might happen if Russia does win territory back? Of course, I'm not saying there's going to be another famine, but it's indicative of how they might be treated by Russia and how perhaps they're looked down a little bit by Russia. So yeah, I think it's a big part of this current conflict too. And it's really important to look back at that history. So yeah, we'll be going deeper into that in this series.
Definitely. One of the big talking points going back beyond this conflict, if we're looking even back to the days of the collapse of the Soviet Union and beyond, is within what we today see as the borders of Ukraine, is the split between the majority Russian-speaking areas and the majority Ukrainian-speaking areas. When the Euromaidan protest happened back 8 years ago, there were, of course, several pro-Russian uprisings and protests across eastern and southern Ukraine, where there are Russian-speaking communities, even Russian-speaking majorities in certain areas. How does that dynamic impact the nation state of Ukraine as we know it today? Before, of course, the Russian intervention and annexation of Crimea.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point, I think. And it's maybe quite a complicated answer too. I mean, I suppose it comes down to sort of fundamentally the sort of Ukrainian identity, really. And I know from people, you mentioned before, that I've been to Ukraine quite a few times. I've been every year since about 2018, often more than once, for several weeks at a time. Really, I haven't really been in the east, but I've been in probably every other part of the country, including majority Russian-speaking parts, like in the south. And the 2014 revolution at Euromaidan, I think it really gave a lot of people that spirit of Ukrainian identity. That was where it really came from. Maybe before then, people, let's say, maybe didn't really care that much about, okay, Ukrainian, it's just the state of the world, but it really didn't mean much more to them than that. But after Maidan, they got rid of a President Yanukovych, who at the time didn't want to sign an agreement to have closer ties with the EU. It's something many Ukrainians want. They see the freedom in the EU. They see people who have democracy, the right to travel, the right to live and work. And they wanted that. They didn't want close relations with Russia. So as a country, the the revolution happened, they got rid of the president, and that affected not just the majority Ukrainian speaking parts, which is predominantly in the central of Ukraine and in the west, like cities like Lviv, for example, but it was also in the south. It was also people in places like Odessa and regions like that, where people just wanted closer cooperation with the EU, even though despite the fact that they are a Russian-speaking majority. So yeah, I think that revolution is a really big point, and I suppose it's in a way directly led to where we are today. Now, with Ukraine wanting to join NATO, which is of course in its constitution as a country, polling that we've seen over the last few weeks show that the country overwhelmingly backs that. So although there is a divide, Ukraine is very much united on that issue, that it wants to be closer to, let's say, the West rather than to Russia, or at least the majority of the country.
Yes, of course. As you mentioned, Yanukovych, who was president of Ukraine in the early 2010s, at a time when Ukraine seemed to be edging more towards the EU. It looked like it was set to become an EU candidate nation. Yanukovych stepped away from that and stepped more towards Putin, which sparked the Euromaidan revolution. To what extent is there some pro-Russian sentiment still existing in Ukraine? Obviously, since since the invasion, Ukraine's been a heavily unified country against the invasion. But even up to that point, was there a large pro-Russian sentiment among certain segments of the population?
In my experience, I've never seen it. I've heard Russian being spoken, like as I mentioned, for example, I've spent a lot of time in Odessa. It's not too far from Crimea. And Russian is spoken there by most people as their first language, even before Ukrainian. But despite that, there's never been an overwhelming feeling from the people I know and that I've spoken to there that they want to be closer to Russia. I've just never ever got that feeling. And in fact, I was there actually not so long ago. I was in Ukraine just in January, a few months back, just before Russia invaded, and I went to Lviv, Kiev, and Odessa, and I'd never actually heard so much Ukrainian spoken in Odessa before. And this was as we had weeks, if not months, of Russia posturing with soldiers on the border, building up the military strength there. And people were really making a point that, okay, no, we're Ukrainian, we're going to speak Ukrainian. It's becoming more about pride now. There's always been a minority of people who I'd say are perhaps from an older generation that have felt closer ties to Russia in the same way that I'd say lots of Russian people feel close ties to Ukraine. The culture and the languages, they're very, very similar. They're not the same. That's an important distinction to make. They're not the same, but they're very, very similar. So there is that almost brotherhood, if you want to say it that, they understand each other. But at the same time, Ukraine wants to choose its own path. People there are united, as you said. We've seen that. Even people before, I think, who maybe didn't care that much about Ukraine, now, in the face of invasion, it matters. It really does matter to them. So, yeah, I think there's always been that minority there, but the majority of the country is united as Ukraine, and that's where they want to be.
Yes, it does strike me that Putin may have done more for Ukrainian unity than anyone else.
Oh, I mean, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's just, whatever he was thinking, if he thought people would just, and I personally think that he did have that feeling that people would just the country would just crumble, basically. But, we've seen them just stick together like glue, and they've been remarkable, really, in, the face of such might and such one of the world's strongest militaries. How they've stuck together has been incredible.
I mean, it's been genuinely inspiring looking both in Ukraine and in Russia, the courage in people in opposition to Putin. Both those who are, taking up arms and fighting for their lives to resist in Ukraine, and those are people who've taken to the streets in Russia, in the full knowledge that they're facing arrest and pariahship in their communities, to oppose Putin and oppose the war.
Yeah, and I mean it's sad, really, isn't it? I mean, you know, you see things on social media now, you know, people in Moscow, and I think I saw a video just today where there was someone in Moscow, I think in Red Square, I think it is, in you know, near the Kremlin, and she literally just held up a sign for a few seconds, and within seconds there were police officers there, you know, dragging her away. And you know, we've seen elderly women, you know, women, children arrested by Russian police. It's not nice. It's not nice to see that. I imagine most people in Russia don't want that. I know a few Russians are there. They've told me they're ashamed of what's going on. You know, they're embarrassed. There was a woman at the demonstration on Saturday in Manchester, a Russian woman, and she was, you know, in tears. She was apologizing. You know, she had to be consoled. She was, you know, couldn't believe it. So, you know, I think the Russian people in this will be really key. I think their response to that will worry Putin, I think, much more than sanctions will do. And they need to really, really kind of step up and you know, have their voice. And it's tough. It's going to be tough on them, but it's just going to be, I think, one of the only ways of resolving this as soon as possible is them putting that pressure on Putin. In my opinion, anyway. I don't know what you think.
Yes, I completely agree. There's only so much external sanctions are going to hurt, because ultimately, so long as the Putin regime has control of information within his country, he's always going to be able to deflect the blame. It's getting that information flow into Russia that's going to be the game changer. Getting that knowledge out that Putin is the aggressor here. Because I'm sure you've seen the opinion polls within Russia, in spite of the demonstrations we see on the streets, that polling suggests a majority of Russians support the invasion. Now, regardless of whether those polls are accurate, whether they're legitimate or not, the message still gets out within Russia that this is a thing that Russians are supporting. And unless that narrative can be counted on the ground, there's not a lot that can be done externally. So it's got to be something that's resolved internally within Russia, and it's going to be an information war to win.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is why social media is going to be so key in this. As we've seen, really, I suppose, in say most conflicts over the last 10 to 15 years, social media has played such a key role, and that will continue to be the case now. And for Russian people, for especially younger ones who use apps like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, I know they've been severely restricted the last few days. Some people are still finding ways around them. And I think they've just got to keep doing that, sharing those messages with each other, because that must mean a lot. If you're there and you oppose this war, you might feel very alone when, you know, you see on all the TV and newspapers that, you know, that what Russia's doing is the right thing. So I think just sharing those messages gives you that solidarity, and I think will be a big part of this. And as it is in Ukraine too, lots of people are using it there to, I'm sure we've all seen some of the horrific images, but, you know, I feel like if that's going on, it's important to share them. It's a form of telling the truth. It's part of this war. And if we can show what's happening to people there, and it encourages the world to step up pressure, encourages Russian people to step up pressure on Putin, then, you know, it's an act all of us can do to help hopefully end this war.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's all we have time for this evening on that note. But as I've said already, this is a fundraiser for Save the Children. Link in the description below. Please do leave what you can. There are a lot of desperate people in desperate situations. If you follow the link there, you'll be able to see all the amazing work Save the Children do. Please consider donating. This has been an introduction to our upcoming series on the Ukraine and Ukrainian history. In due course, we'll be bringing you some special looks at various topics in Ukrainian history. But until then, it's goodbye from me, it's goodbye from Declan, and we'll see you soon.